Sometimes, a man's arrogance can be his greatest lesson. When James Windsor, millionaire CEO, laughingly challenged his cleaning lady to translate an impossible document, he thought he had easily won. But what happened next changed forever his life and that of all his employees. Prepare yourself for a story that will make you rethink how you judge people. It was a Friday evening in November when everything changed on the 40th floor of the Windsor Group skyscraper in the heart of Canary Wharf. James Windsor, 42 years old, CEO of the family empire worth £200 million, was finishing a particularly frustrating day. The contract with the Chinese partners had been blocked for 3 days due to translation problems. The technical document, written in ancient Mandarin with specific commercial terminology, had put even the best professional translators in London in difficulty. No one could completely decipher the meaning of some crucial clauses. James had spent hours on the phone with translation agencies, linguistic consultants, even university professors. The problem was that he had no time. The Chinese were expecting an answer by Monday, and the £50 million deal was in danger of falling through. He was sitting at his mahogany desk, the Chinese document open in front of him, when Margaret Thompson entered for the evening cleaning. 56 years old, gray hair neatly tied in a ponytail, she wore the blue uniform of the cleaning company. She had worked in this office for 8 years, always punctual, always silent, always invisible. Margaret began to empty the waste paper baskets and dust, moving with the discretion of one who knows she must not disturb. James barely noticed her, concentrated as he was on his problems. For him, Margaret was just part of the furniture, a necessary but despicable presence. It was when Margaret approached the desk to clean that her eyes fell on the Chinese document. James saw something strange. The woman stopped for a second, as if she had recognized something. When James timidly asked if she had problems, he replied curtly that it was complicated stuff. International contracts, not for everyone. Margaret continued working, but her eyes often returned to the document. There was something in the way she looked at it, as if she understood it. Curiosity got the better of him. James asked her why she kept looking at that document. Margaret replied that it looked like Chinese, and James burst out laughing. A long, loud laugh full of condescension. The comment that followed was cruel and classist. He told her she barely knew English, let alone Chinese. For him, it was natural to think that a woman like Margaret couldn't know anything about foreign languages. But Margaret insisted, saying quietly that she knew a bit of Chinese. James laughed even more, explaining that it was ancient Mandarin with specific commercial terminology, that the best translators in London couldn't decipher it completely. Seized by a cruel impulse, James grabbed the document and waved it in front of Margaret. The challenge came out like a joke, a way to humiliate this woman who dared to think she knew something he didn't. If you manage to translate this document, I'll give you my monthly salary, £100,000. James was convinced that Margaret would stammer some excuse and return to her cleaning. But Margaret raised her eyes, and for the first time in 8 years, James saw something different in her gaze. She was no longer the timid and submissive cleaning lady. She was someone else. Margaret asked if he was sure about this bet. James nodded, still laughing, convinced it was impossible for anyone who hadn't studied sinology. Margaret took the document and examined it carefully. Then, with a calm and confident voice, she began to translate. Sentence after sentence, paragraph after paragraph, she translated the document with a precision that left James speechless. She not only knew Chinese, but she perfectly understood the commercial terminology, the legal nuances, even the cultural references hidden in the text. When she finished, a heavy silence fell over the office. James stared at Margaret, as if seeing her for the first time. Margaret explained that she had a degree in Oriental languages and literature from Cambridge, that she had worked for 10 years as an interpreter for British companies in China. She was cleaning, because at 56 nobody hired interpreters anymore. And she had to support her daughter, who was studying medicine. James remained speechless. 8 years. For 8 years he had treated as a nobody a woman who probably knew more than him about many subjects. Margaret smiled, a smile that had nothing submissive about it, and asked when she could collect her salary. Monday morning, James Windsor couldn't concentrate on anything. He had spent the weekend thinking about what had happened, and each time he felt smaller and more petty. Margaret's translation had been perfect. He had called the Chinese partners on Saturday morning, and they had confirmed the accuracy of every word. The contract had been signed. The $50 million deal was saved, and all thanks to a woman he had always considered invisible. But it wasn't just that which tormented him. It was the realization of how blind, arrogant, and classist he had been. How many other people had he judged based on their work, their clothes, their accent? At 9 o'clock precisely, Margaret entered the office for the morning cleaning. James was waiting for her, determined to speak to her. When he told her they needed to talk, Margaret thought he wanted to go back on the bet. But James stopped her. A bet was a bet. He owed her £100,000. But first, he wanted her to tell him her story. For the first time in 8 years, Margaret sat in that office not as an employee, but as a person. Margaret told him she had been born in London to Pakistani immigrant parents. Her father was a builder, her mother a cleaner. They had worked 16 hours a day to pay for her studies. She had graduated with first-class honors in Oriental languages, spoke Chinese, Japanese, English, Spanish. She had started working as an interpreter for companies doing business with Asia in the 90s. She had met Robert, an engineer. Her daughter Emma was born. When Robert died in a car accident, Emma was 12 and Margaret was 40. She had tried to return to full-time work, but 12 years of part-time in the translation world was like a century. At 40, she was already too old for that world. She had started doing all kinds of work: waitress, carer, shop assistant. 8 years ago, she had found this cleaning job. It paid so well that she could send Emma to university. Now her daughter was studying medicine in her 4th year. James asked why she had never said anything, why she had never made known that she had these skills. Margaret pointed out that in 8 years he had never asked her a question about her life. He had never asked how she was, what she did in her free time, if she had family. For him, she was just the cleaning lady. James felt himself sinking. It was true. In 8 years, Margaret had been just a silent presence, a function, not a person. He admitted to being an idiot, worse, an arrogant classist, who judged people by their clothes and their work. He said that Margaret had given him the most important lesson of his life. James went to the safe and took out an envelope with £100,000 in cash. But then he did something more. He offered her the position of Director of International Relations with Asia. Starting salary, £200,000 per year. Margaret remained speechless. James told her to say yes, and to teach him never to judge people by appearances again. 2 weeks later, the 40th floor of the Windsor Group skyscraper was unrecognizable in atmosphere. James had begun a silent revolution that was changing everything. Margaret Thompson, now Director of International Asian Relations, had an office overlooking the Thames. She wore elegant suits instead of the blue uniform, but above all she had regained the dignity she had lost 8 years earlier. Her first project was a resounding success. Using her old connections and her knowledge of Asian culture, she managed to sign 3 important contracts. The Windsor Group's turnover increased by 30% in 2 weeks. But the most important change was in James himself. The man who previously crossed the office without greeting anyone now stopped to talk to everyone. He wanted to know their stories, their dreams, their hidden skills. The discoveries were surprising. Mark, the photocopying assistant, had a degree in computer engineering. James promoted him to head of IT. Sandra, the receptionist, spoke perfect German and French. She became head of Europe. George, the driver, had deep knowledge of the property sector, and was put in charge of a new division. Every day brought new discoveries. James realized that in his company there was a treasure of skills he had always ignored. Brilliant people doing underpaid jobs because nobody had ever bothered to find out what they could really do. One afternoon, while reviewing the accounts with Margaret, James confessed to having wasted 8 years of her life. Margaret replied that they hadn't been wasted years, but preparation years. Every experience, even cleaning his offices, had taught her something. James asked how she managed not to hate him for the way he had treated her. Margaret explained that hatred builds nothing, and that he had done something few CEOs would have done: admit being wrong and try to make amends. James confessed that since he had started really talking to his employees,
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
he had understood that he wasn't just a bad boss, but a bad person. He lived in a bubble, surrounded by people who only told him what he wanted to hear. Margaret told him that her daughter Emma had always told her that people can change if they have the courage to look at themselves in the mirror. James had had that courage. James expressed the wish to be present when Emma graduated, if Margaret would allow him. Margaret accepted, surprised and moved. At that moment, James understood that true wealth wasn't his millions in the bank, but the possibility of growing, learning, becoming a better person. And all thanks to a woman he had judged only by her work. 3 months after the Chinese document episode, the story had gone around London. The Windsor Group had become the most coveted company as a workplace. Turnover had grown by 60%, but above all, the corporate culture had changed. James had instituted the Hidden Talents program. Every month he dedicated time to personally getting to know each employee, to discover their skills, to understand how they could be valued. But the real transformation was in James himself. The man who previously lived only for profit now understood that true success is measured in human terms, not just economic ones. One day, while reviewing Asian contracts with Margaret, came a phone call that changed everything again. It was St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Margaret's daughter had had a serious motorcycle accident. The journey to the hospital was the longest in Margaret's life. James drove in silence, while she prayed quietly. At the hospital, a doctor was waiting for them with a grave expression. Emma had suffered serious spinal injuries. The operation was very complex, requiring specialists and specific equipment. The cost was £300,000, a sum that the NHS couldn't cover completely. Margaret felt her world collapse. Even with her new salary, she couldn't afford such a sum. James told the doctor to do everything necessary, that he would take care of the expenses. When Margaret protested, he reminded her that 4 months earlier she had saved him a $50 million contract, but above all, she had saved him as a person. The operation lasted 8 hours. James remained at the hospital the whole time, beside Margaret. They were no longer the CEO and employee, but two people who had learned to respect each other and care for one another. When the surgeon came out announcing that the operation had been completely successful, James and Margaret embraced, crying with joy. In the following days, while Emma recovered, James discovered another side of Margaret, the mother who had fought all her life for her daughter. And Margaret saw in James not the rich CEO, but a man who had learned to love without expecting anything in return. One evening, while they were watching over Emma, Margaret asked James why he had done all this. He replied that he had learned that when you have a lot, you must know how to give, and that Margaret had given him much more than he had ever given her. James confessed that Margaret had taught him that true success isn't how much you earn, but how many lives you manage to improve. A year after Emma's accident, everyone's life had changed radically. Emma had completed rehabilitation and was about to graduate in medicine with top marks. Margaret had become one of the most respected executives in London. James had discovered that true leadership consists of inspiring and valuing people. The Windsor Group had become a case study in business universities, a company that had revolutionized human resources management proving that when you invest in people, economic results are a natural consequence. But the real revolution was deeper. James had begun to look around him with new eyes. Every person had a story, skills, dreams. The barista, the taxi driver, the shop assistant, all had something to teach. One day, entering a restaurant, he saw an elderly man selling newspapers on the corner. Something in his way of speaking struck him. The man spoke elegantly, used perfect English, had refined manners. James approached and bought a newspaper. The man introduced himself as Professor Davies, former lecturer in English literature at Oxford. Minimum pension, expensive rent, 2 unemployed children. The newspapers helped him make ends meet. James discovered that the professor had encyclopedic knowledge of literature, history, art, a treasure of culture that was being wasted. James offered him to teach his executives general culture, art history, literature applied to business. The pay would be much better than what he earned selling newspapers. That evening, he told Margaret everything. She pointed out that he had learned to see talents everywhere, people that society had discarded, but who still had much to give. James announced that he wanted to create a foundation to help people rediscover their value, find their way. He called it Second Chance Foundation. In the following months, the foundation took shape. James invested £5 million of his personal wealth. It offered training courses, retraining programs, support for those who had lost their jobs. The first project was a training center for people over 40 who wanted to reinvent themselves professionally. Margaret became the director, putting her experience at the service of those who had lived through her same difficulties. At the center's inauguration, Margaret told James that when he had challenged her to translate that document, he didn't know he was changing the lives of hundreds of people. James realized that change has a domino effect. He had changed. Margaret had found her path. Emma had become a doctor. And now they were helping other people change their lives. James looked at the center full of people who were learning and growing. He told Margaret that sometimes a moment, a spark, is enough to change everything. 3 years after that Friday evening that had changed everything, James Windsor was about to give the most important speech of his life. Cambridge University had invited him to speak to the graduates of the Economics and Management course. In the front row sat Margaret, elegant in a dark blue suit, next to her daughter Emma, now a specialist doctor in neurosurgery. Behind them, the entire Windsor Group team and the first graduates of the Second Chance Foundation. James began by telling the story of how a cleaning lady had taught him the true meaning of success. He told everything: the arrogance of that Friday evening, the challenge thrown out as a joke, the lesson in humility he had received. He explained to the audience that when Margaret translated that document, she wasn't just winning a bet. She was teaching him that a person's value doesn't depend on the work they do, but on what they have inside. James continued by telling how that lesson had transformed his company, his life, his vision of the world. He said that today the Windsor Group had a turnover of £300 million a year. But that wasn't his success. His success was learning that a CEO who doesn't know the people working for him isn't a leader, just a manager. It was discovering that when you invest in people, they invest in you. James looked at Margaret, who smiled at him with pride. He said that his success was understanding that true wealth isn't measured in pounds, but in improved lives, in valued talents, in people who have regained their dignity. When he finished the speech, the applause was thunderous, but James only had eyes for Margaret, the woman who had changed his life with a simple translation. After the ceremony, while they were returning to the office, Margaret told him she was proud of him, that he had become the man she had hoped he could become that evening. James replied that she had always been the extraordinary woman she was. He had only learned to see her. James asked what they should do now. Margaret smiled and said they should continue. Keep looking for hidden talents. Give second chances. Prove that people's value has nothing to do with their social status. James proposed doing it together, as partners, as friends, as people who had learned that shared success is the only one really worth having. While the car took them towards the Canary Wharf skyscraper, James thought about how much his life had changed. 3 years earlier, he had been a lonely, arrogant man, surrounded by wealth, but poor in humanity. Now he was surrounded by people who respected him not for his money, but for what he had become. In the lift, James asked Margaret something that had tormented him for 3 years. If that evening she had been angry with him when she translated the document, Margaret replied that she wasn't angry, but disappointed. Disappointed because she thought he was different from how she had imagined him in 8 years of cleaning. James asked how she saw him now. Margaret smiled and said she knew he was exactly the man she had hoped he would be. He had just needed a little push to bring it out. James thanked her for giving him that push. Margaret thanked him for knowing how to change, because not everyone is capable of it. As they entered the office that had once belonged only to James and was now shared with Margaret, both knew that their story was just beginning. When you learn to see people's value, you discover that the world is full of hidden wonders, ready to be discovered by those who have the courage to look beyond appearances. Like James learned that true success is measured in improved lives, you too can discover that the most precious people are often those we notice least. If this story has made you reflect, like it has made millions of people reflect, leave a like and share this video with someone who needs to remember that every person has unique value. But above all, don't miss the next episode where you'll discover another incredible story of how a gesture of humility can completely change a life. Click subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any story that can transform your way of seeing the world. In the next video, poor waiter pays the bill for a rich family. What happens the next day changes his life forever. A story that will leave you speechless.